and we can start. I'm Shoshana Bryen. I'm the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center. I'm very pleased to be here today and very pleased that the Jewish Policy Center is co-hosting with the Independent Women's Forum. When we were planning these panels, we were talking about themes and topics and trying to create some narrow streams in which to stay. Simple topic sentences, simple subject matter, but things kept getting longer and more complicated and more convoluted. Today we're going to move from Uzbekistan to Iran, to Malaysia, to North Korea, to Africa, and back to the United States. We're going to go from bad news to good news, to things you need to know, to things that you didn't know you needed to know, but once you know them, you have to think about them differently. And the farther afield we ran, the more complicated things got until we realized we were crossing over the same issues and the same people in various networks and axes and alliances, good ones and bad ones. So we've divided ourselves into two panels to talk about networks and axes and alliances and how these things work. The rules are going to be the same for both panels. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers. They will each speak, and we'll hold Q&A at the end. We already had our national security test on your telephones, and for those who weren't here when the test went off at about, 2:30, it was really interesting. But if you would turn your phones off, please, we would appreciate it. To my left is Michaela Dodge, who specializes in missile defense, nuclear weapons modernization, and arms control as a policy analyst for defense and strategic policy at the Heritage Foundation. She has also been a fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Claremont Institute. And actually, she's about to go off in a new direction, and she is going to join the staff of Senator John Kyle on Friday, which is great for Michaela and really excellent for Senator Kyle. She's going to talk about strategic deterrence and the importance of nuclear weapons modernization for the United States in today's national security environment, in which we face some very nasty alliances running from North Korea to Pakistan to Iran. To Michaela's left is Lee Smith, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and author of The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations. If you want one book to read about the Middle East and how things work and how people do what they do, I strongly recommend The Strong Horse. Lee is going to discuss the Iranian network, especially as it operates in the Levant, where it touches on three of America's allies. Ilan Berman is Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, where he focuses on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the CIA and the Defense Department, and he's widely published. Ilan is our good news panelist this afternoon. You have to have one good news panelist on every panel. He begins with the premise that there are partners for the United States in the war of ideas against radical Islam, but only if we recognize them and only if we work with them. So with that as our setup, I'm going to ask Michaela.
All right, thank you. Can I go to the podium?
Sure can.
Okay. Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with my friends and colleagues, so thank you for this event. I wish I was here for the previous part of it. I'm sorry I missed that. I was asked to talk about, or I chose to talk about, nuclear deterrence issues. They're particularly relevant for our allies and for our adversaries alike. And today I'm going to talk about three issues, and I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards. This will not be a good news panel, unfortunately. I'm going to talk about differences between the Obama administration's and the Trump administration's nuclear weapons policy. Second, about the importance and the status of nuclear weapons modernization. And third, what kind of big debates we might expect in years ahead that will impact both the United States and our allies. So first, the main difference between the two nuclear policies is the level of optimism with which they treat the question of Russia. So in 2010, we thought that Russia was no longer an adversary and that the potential for conflict with Russia was low. we wanted to decrease the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy. We started from the premise that we really want to create these conditions that would allow us to eliminate nuclear weapons eventually. Now, we were also assuming that we would lead the creation of that framework by example, and so we would take steps that eventually would be reciprocated by other countries, including nuclear weapon powers. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and that event reinforced some very powerful continuities in US nuclear weapons policy. Most importantly, we've recognized the indispensability of nuclear weapons to US national security. We decided that we would not decrease the alert levels of US nuclear weapons, and that we said that we would invest and continue to invest in both nuclear weapons modernization and in the national nuclear complex that supports US nuclear weapons. Now, in 2018, we are returning to the era of great power competition. That is explicitly noted in the National Security Strategy and in the National Defense Strategy. Now, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, China was expanded militarily in the South China Seas and embarking on its own nuclear buildup. Now, the US government takes great power strategic threats into account while tailoring our deterrence posture and while communicating and reaching out to our allies. Now, describing the National Defense Strategy released in January, Secretary Mattis said, "Great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of US national security." But don't worry, terrorism is still a focus of US national security. Now, focusing on major power threats and taking into account what your adversaries do might seem like a common sense, but I have heard very serious people argue that it really doesn't matter, and it should not matter for how the United States postures its nuclear forces. And of course, such a leap of faith is very necessary if your goal is to decrease the role of nuclear weapons in the national security strategy. Now, of course, that requires quite a leap of faith. Second, nuclear weapons modernization. Now, sometimes we think only about platforms, about our bombers, about our land-based ballistic missiles, about submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and about other shorter-range systems that support extending deterrence to our allies. Now, but there are warheads that need to be delivered by these systems, and in some ways, though modernization of those warheads, President is calling.
I wouldn't answer it. I would defer to you.
So sometimes what we expect of our delivery system is to deliver nuclear warheads. And in some ways, the modernization of the nuclear weapons complex supporting nuclear warheads is much more troubled than modernization of delivery systems. As far as I know, every single nuclear posture review since the end of the Cold War has stated that US nuclear infrastructure needs to be flexible, resilient, and modernized. Now, those are just about the last words when you would think today about National Nuclear Security Administration, where I think as much as half the building date is older than 40 years, and about a third dates all the way back to the Manhattan Project of the Second World War. Now, the buildings are only part of it. Of course, what matters is the human capital supporting this complex. And right now, we are not training enough people to replace people who are eligible for retirement in the next 5 years. And so we are creating gaps where we don't have modern infrastructure, but we also are not training up enough people that would be able to accomplish things that we are asking them to do. How certain are we that we understand aging effects on our nuclear warheads? How certain are we that we will be able to take these aged warheads and put them on our new modern delivery systems? Now, it's thousands of parts. They have to work in split-second precision, and sometimes even different material batches made a difference in nuclear weapons performance. And of course, we used to be able to have more insight into these kinds of problems when we had an active nuclear weapons testing program, but we have not had that in something like 25 years. Now, it all sounds really wonky, but why does it matter? It matters because if our adversaries do not believe that our nuclear weapons work, they will be more likely, they will be more aggressive, including in conventional scenarios. Why does it matter for our allies? If they do not believe that US nuclear weapons work and that they can rely on US extended deterrence, they will be more likely to develop their own nuclear weapon capabilities. And some of these allies live in very, very difficult neighborhoods. Which brings me a little bit to my third point. What kind of big debates can we expect in the nuclear area in the next decade? Our current warheads have an expiration date, and that much is certain. We have a stockpiled stewardship program in place, and it has been more successful than we've anticipated, but it is not a substitute for an active nuclear weapons program. Now, even if we wanted to conduct a nuclear weapons test, we probably could do it very fast just to make a weapon go off, but we would not be able to gain as much insight because we don't know how to properly instrument these tests anymore. It's just these skills are fading, and we have very few people left who have practical experience with nuclear weapon designs. What we are witnessing today is the beginning of a de facto disarmament by attrition. Now, the next big debate is important not only for nuclear weapons, but for US defense in general. We still have the Budget Control Act, and will have until something changes until 2022. The potential chairman of the House Armed Services Committee is already calling on the Pentagon to get ready for leaner budget years, even as we see more and more evidence that our forces are under huge stress from high operational tempo and not enough capability and not enough capacity. Now, our Navy is getting more done with less. And just to give you kind of a perception of scale, China is commissioning a new ship every 2 weeks. So it's not only the capacity we currently have, it's also the defense industrial base supporting that capacity. Now, even worse, our nuclear weapons and conventional forces modernization is going to compete against each other in declining budgets, again, provided that the Budget Control Act stays the law of the land. The Congressional Budget Office puts the cost of maintaining and modernizing nuclear weapons at about $1.2 trillion over between 2017 and 2046. That's $1.2 trillion. Obviously, that's a huge amount of money. Now, my gripe with this number is that we rarely see it presented in the context. So it's between 4 to 8% of the Department of Defense budget, and the DoD's budget itself is not that large a percent of the GDP. And then, if I tell you that the Army is going to spend $1 trillion buying shoelaces over the next 500 years or whatever, I can make any number look really, really large to kind of cause that sticker shock. Secretary Mattis said, we can afford survival. And that's very, very much true. And it's particularly true when it comes to one of the very few threats that can end or alter the life in the United States as we know it. My favorite movie, one of my favorite movies, is a cult classic, Red Dawn. It's a 1984 movie. And there is a scene when the Air Force pilot that gets shot down has a conversation with the Wolverines, which are the kids, kind of the guerrilla countering the Soviets. And they ask him, what started the war? And he says, I don't know, two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. And they say, that's simple, is it? And he responds, or maybe somebody just forgot what it was like. And I worry that it takes a very short time, maybe a generation or less, to become complacent about major threats. And it's particularly true for democracies like the United States. Today, we are at a point when we're in danger of forgetting what it's like to field and maintain nuclear forces protecting us from one of the most existential threats, that assure our allies, that make world in a way more simplified, that give us room to kind of worry about, relatively speaking, smaller stuff than the big strategic country-altering security problems. Now, those who remember are rapidly retiring, and training a new generation with that expertise and maintaining political will to provide necessary resources, I think is going to be one of our most important defense challenges in the coming decade. And so I'm really glad to see this forum where we can discuss some of these issues, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
That's okay. These are on?
They are on.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Independent Women's Forum, the Jewish Policy Center. Thank you, Shoshana, for moderating the panel, and thank you to both of my co-panelists. And Michaela, I didn't know this would be such a fantastic, that your detailed and interesting talk would be an excellent introduction to my rambling, relatively brief riff, talking about nuclear detente. What I want to talk about, I'll come about it in a circuitous fashion. I'm eventually going to talk about Iranian networks in the Middle East. But the way I want to get there is by talking about, I think, the last 25 years of administrations in American foreign policy has been different ways to figure out what we've been doing since the Cold War. I think actually a lot of other things that we're seeing as well, a general liberal order in terms of politics across Europe, politics here in the United States. I think we're renegotiating different ideas about what the Cold War was about. And if you look at the administrations, if you look at Bush 41, if you look at the Clinton administration and the idea of the peace dividend, especially as this hit different parts of the Middle East, if you look at the Bush administration, and if you look at the freedom agenda, and then if you look at the Obama administration, I think the place that I really want to start, though, is with the Bush administration, Bush 43, because I think that what happened with 9/11, I think that 9/11 derailed consideration of what a post-Cold War American foreign policy should look like. I think the Obama administration had the opportunity. They understood it wasn't what the Bush administration thought of. If we can, let's use a little bit of shorthand with the Bush administration, whether we want to call it in different terms, if they want to talk about the freedom agenda and democracy promotion, whether we want to talk about the focus on counterterrorism. I think that the Obama administration had a very clear vision that the issue was nation states. The problem, from my perspective, I'm sure other people will argue, the problem, the way I see it, is that the Obama administration flipped our alliances on its head. So while they saw it in terms of nation states, they picked the wrong nation states to partner with and the wrong nation states to unleash. About 2 weeks ago, there was an interesting article, which I recommend, in the Washington Post about Gina Haspel, the director of the CIA, a talk that she gave in Louisville, where she talked about the emphasis that we are returning to an emphasis on nation states. Now, again, I think that the Obama administration did focus on nation states. The confusion was with the Bush administration, which is nonetheless lingering. The different ideas that the Bush administration had, particularly on the Middle East, the different things that we're going to fight, the different contests that we're going to get involved in. And I think that these ideas are still lingering in different ways, whether we see it in terms of looking at the Middle East in sectarian terms, who are the Sunni, who are the Shia, who are our partners. The Middle East may see it like this in terms of sectarianism. Insofar as this has been how American policymakers have seen it, it was a disaster. It continues to be a catastrophe. As some of you may remember, being here post 9/11, we heard different people recommending the Shia as the American, as an American instrument of progress in the region. This is not for American policymakers to do. We hear different people talk about the minorities in the Middle East. Again, this is not, it's my conviction. It's not for American policymakers to do. We should be looking at nation states and partners. Insofar as people talk about Middle East minorities and we have to protect them, that's a big mistake. I know that people want to talk about this in humanitarian terms, and I'm sympathetic with the idea that there are problems, that Christian communities, Yazidi communities are under threat. But let's remember, there have been 500,000 Sunnis who have been slaughtered in Syria. Okay, so when we start talking about Middle Eastern minorities and the idea that we're talking about threatened Christian communities, let's remember who's been run through a meat grinder in the Levant. In any case, the larger issue, again, is to see it in terms of nation states. So again, let me just speak very quickly about how I think it's important to see Syria right now. You hear different people talking about, well, right now, the Syrian war, it's winding down. I don't really believe the Syrian conflict is winding down, but you'll hear different people saying, well, it's about states. It's about Russia, and it's about Turkey, and it's about Iran. It was always about states. It was never about, Obama understood that it was about states, and he described this quite clearly. Obama perceived Syria as an Iranian interest. When he talked about acknowledging Iranian equities in Syria, what he was talking about Syria as a supply line for Hezbollah. That's what he meant. When we talk about a land bridge, it's an Iranian land bridge. It's always been, these conflicts have always been about states. It's never been about 7,000 guys with beards and Toyota trucks. This has been, again, I believe that this has been a catastrophe for American strategic thinking, insofar as we're looking at different jihadi groups to go after, whether this is Afghanistan, or whether this is Syria, or whether this is Yemen, or whether this is Iraq. It's a mistake. It's a misapplication of American resources, American energies, and it's not the way to understand the world works. The world not only works in terms of nation states, American diplomacy and foreign policy works better when we understand it that way. And that's not to say that we should necessarily be in the business of promoting or ensuring that people become states. Let me just take an example. I'll use the example of Lebanon. Now, the United States, I believe it's especially the Department of Defense, that believes it's an important, not vital, not that important, but that it's not a huge loss if the United States throws away $150 million a year to enhance the capabilities of the Lebanese armed forces, because the idea is to build state institutions. The problem is the state is Hezbollah. Hezbollah controls what's happening, controls the borders, controls decisions of state that are supposed to be made by the state. So when people come up with interesting nuances between Hezbollah and between Lebanon, Hezbollah has the power to make war or peace. That's the state. not who decides when the garbage gets collected, not who decides who gets to teach in what schools. It's about powers of war and peace and what's happening on the borders. So let me just talk again very quickly about how to understand Iranian networks in Syria. Hezbollah, of course, is the most important one and the most successful projection of Iranian power. You've heard lots of people, this was before the Freedom Agenda, this was before 9/11, people talked about the Lebanonization of Hezbollah, meaning that its command and control decisions really came from inside Lebanon. They don't come from inside Lebanon. As we certainly saw, as we've seen with the Syrian conflict, Hezbollah and these other groups are controlled by the Iranians. So I'm just going to bring this to a close very quickly, but I think that the Syrian conflict, and I think the middle of the Middle East as well as Iraq, I think it's important for us to see this in terms of how actual nation states project power, not in terms of various myriad groups fighting for religious, sectarian, historic primacy. Let's just see it in terms of nation states. So that's it in short.
I think you'll have lots of questions when we
Okay.
get to
I look
questions.
forward-
Thank you,
okay.
Ilan.
Thanks.
Ilan?
All right, I have a lot to talk about and a really short time in which to do it. So please bear with me. I'm from New England, so I talk very fast anyway. So I'm going to talk maybe faster than usual. So first of all, let me thank Shoshana and Claudia and the Independence Women's Forum and the Jewish Policy Center for putting this on. I think this is a real contribution to the discussion, which for all those of you that live in Washington or live around Washington, there's an awful lot of heat, but there's not a lot of light these days on really important policy issues. So I'm glad we could do this. Shoshana also mentioned that I'm the good news speaker. I am, but you have to be patient, right? Because, the old axiom in marketing is that in order to sell people aspirin, you first have to convince them that they have a headache. So the first part of my talk is going to be to try to convince you, and I don't think it's going to take much convincing, that we have a real headache. And we have a real headache because we're very good at fighting the last war. We're not so good at looking ahead and looking strategically in terms of what can be done to get ahead of the decision-making cycle of our adversaries. And when I talk about adversaries, in this case, I'm talking about extremist Islamic groups that continue to predominate the intellectual and the political milieu in the Middle East. So it's very good headlines, and I think it's a very good feel-good moment when we hear our national leadership talk about the end of ISIS. And in many ways, this is, I think, a correct description. At the height of its power in the middle of 2014, the Islamic State's caliphate, occupied a geographic territory roughly the size of the United Kingdom. They had something on the order of 8 million citizens under its control. So the Islamic State was a proto-state for all intents and purposes. They acted in ways in which a state did. For example, much of their revenue, unlike groups like Al-Qaeda, was generated by taxation rather than by donations from wealthy state funders. Today, the situation is very different. We've eroded something like 94 to 96% of ISIS territory, and we've dried up more than 2/3 of their annual revenue. And we haven't done this alone, by the way, right? We've done this as part of a very broad coalition consisting of on the order of upwards of 50 nations that have come together to join the anti-ISIS coalition. But that's where the conversation generally stops. We really don't think much further than what comes after ISIS. We don't really have that conversation. And this is a very long conversation, but for the purposes of our discussion, I would point out there are 5 things. I'm sure there are many more than 5, but there are 5 things for our discussion that I would worry about. Looking ahead in what has, as former CIA Director Jim Woolsey liked to characterize, is the long war of the 21st century. The first is ISIS is a tube of toothpaste. So for those of you that have small children, I have small children, When the small children squeeze the tube of toothpaste, what happens? Right? You have a huge mess, right, which you usually have to clean up. But the toothpaste goes everywhere. If the toothpaste is removed from the middle, it comes out the top and it comes out the bottom. And that's precisely what you're seeing happening to the foreign extremists that have joined the Islamic State in the past. As the caliphate has eroded in the Syria and Iraq space, they have increasingly migrated to other theaters like Libya, or like the Chad Basin in Africa, or Indonesia and Malaysia in South and Southeast Asia. This is because this is a more permissive operating environment for these radicals. They're still radical. They just understand that they're more constrained in their operations in the Middle East than they were before. The second problem is the rise of local jihads. So let's posit that between 2014 and 2016, 2017, there was a massive ideological tug of war that was taking place between Al-Qaeda, which represented the old, and the Islamic State, which represented the new, upstart, more radical, more millenarian vision of extremist Islam. And the Islamic State won that competition, that ideological tug of war. But what you saw, in very much the same fashion as you saw during the Cold War, is you saw groups that were ideological fellow travelers pick sides, because everyone loves a winner. And so the Islamic State, as it grew stronger in power, accrued all of these movements and groups that adhered to its cause, that pledged bayat, pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and a lesser number that pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So if everyone loves a winner, everyone hates a loser. So as the Islamic State has declined in terms of its power, all of these organizations have become unmoored from the Islamic State core. And this is important because, with the exception of some fringe groups in the north of Syria, all of these organizations, organizations like the Caucasus Emirate in Russia, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, all of these have pre-existing organizational structures, which means that they are able to operate independently. They had a history before the Islamic State, and they're going to have a history after it. So we've replaced a confined territorial war on terror in the Iraq-Syria space with a more diffuse series of conflicts that are likely to flare up in these other places as these guys go home. Speaking of which, the third problem that we're confronting is foreign fighter returnees. The United States is certainly not unique, but it's necessary to talk about the scope of this problem. In the decade between 1979 and 1989, from the start of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to the moment where the last Soviet tank rolled out of Afghanistan, academics estimate that the Afghan jihad, as it was known, drew 20,000 foreign fighters to its cause. 20,000 foreign fighters from across the Middle East and North Africa that took up arms, mobilized, joined the Mujahideen in fighting the Soviets. By way of comparison, U.S. experts estimate that from mid-2014, when the Islamic State was first established, until earlier this year, ISIS had managed to mobilize twice that number from something on the order of 80 separate countries around the Muslim world and also in the West to join its cause. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. So if you remember back to the bad old days of the early and mid-1990s, when the return of the so-called Afghan alumni created a surge of terrorism in the countries where they came from, countries like Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco and Egypt, this is what we're on the cusp of now. And this is why European countries are so concerned about returnees and about how to deal with them. And every country has their own formula. Countries like Australia have gotten rid of citizenship entirely for people who mobilize. Countries like Tajikistan have actually declared an amnesty and tried to reintegrate them into society, right? Everybody has their own proper sort of golden medium, golden mean that they're trying to achieve, but it is a real problem. And there's a series of other problems as well, but for the sake of time, I would move on to where we were, because this is not in chronological order. This is what we just heard was where we are now. Where we were is that we've had successive administrations in Washington that have tried to deal with this problem in different ways. The Bush administration talked a lot about a forward strategy that favors freedom, as Lee mentioned, and the idea of promoting democratic peace. But in real terms, in kinetic terms, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you were to ask the Bush administration at the tail end of its second term, are we winning the war on terror? The answer would very much come in the shape of metrics. Here's how we're faring in Afghanistan. Here's how we're faring in Iraq. Very little discussion about whether those gains are sustainable, whether those gains are permanent, and whether there are other fronts where we should be fighting. The Obama administration had a different approach, consistent with President Obama's discussions about a leading from behind, which I always found to be a slightly strange euphemism. We embrace the idea of a lighter footprint in the Middle East, in particular in the Muslim world generally, and President Obama tried very hard diplomatically to reset relations. Right? So all of us remember the mid-2009 Cairo address, which he called a new beginning, in which he essentially told a fifth of humanity that we've had problems with the Muslim world's had problems with us, we should do better, right? Which is, I would argue, a little bit of an oversimplification of the entire situation. And the Trump administration now, coming on the heels of these two very different approaches, is trying to square the circle. So the Trump national security strategy, which came out in December, talks about fighting a long war, quote, against these fanatics who advance a totalitarian vision for a global Islamist caliphate that justifies murder and slavery, promotes repression, and seeks to undermine the American way of life, which is quite a mouthful, I would say, right, as a sentence. But it is a different conception of the problem. But what we haven't seen yet is a reorientation of American strategy to better adapt to this task. And this is where the good news comes in. Do all of you know the story of Willie Sutton? So, yeah, okay. So in the 1930s and 40s, Willie Sutton was a famous American bank robber that pulled off a series of heists across the American Midwest and in Philadelphia, I think. And when the FBI finally caught up to him, because it was interstate crimes, they asked him a very simple question. They said, why do you keep robbing banks? And he looked at them like they were crazy. He said, because that's where the money is. Okay? So counterterrorism strategy should follow the Willie Sutton rule. We should go where the money is, or in this case, where the action is. And the action is far less on the battlefield than it is in the intellectual war of ideas. And this is a domain where the United States really hasn't excelled, really hasn't engaged in any meaningful way. But others have. And this is, I think, the sort of the revelatory moment that the United States needs as we begin to pivot our strategy. If you look, so first of all, right, a few basic numbers. The Muslim world is 1.7 billion people. It's a fifth of humanity, and only a fraction is in the Middle East. Only 400 million of that 1.7 billion is actually in the Middle East. So we've actually, I would argue, been looking in the wrong place in our counterterrorism policy. Over 1 billion Muslims cumulatively live in Asia. When you rack and stack the populations of Malaysia and Pakistan and Indonesia and China, right? There's a much more target-rich environment. And these are voices that we're not really hearing. If it bleeds, it leads. And so we've been focusing very much on the Middle East. But across the length and breadth of the Muslim world, there are models, alternative models of organization in which Muslims themselves have tried to push back against the ideology of the Islamic State, the ideology of al-Qaeda. We just haven't been paying attention. So I'd end with just 3 very quick examples. The first is Indonesia. This is the world's largest majority Muslim nation. They have a population roughly analogous to the United States, right? 270 million people. It's a place where Islam came to the archipelago over the span of centuries, but didn't dominate, but absorbed these local traditions, which is why scholars often talk of an Indonesian third way of tolerant Islam. It's not necessarily compatible with the interpretations that you see in the Middle East, but nonetheless, it exists and it's viable. And it comes, as the Indonesians like to say, nation state before caliphate. When I was there earlier this year, I heard that a lot. And that really embodies their principle, which is that you can have confessional identification, but the confessional identification should not come at the expense of the sovereignty of the state. And it's a model that is not undermined, but reinforced by these mass Muslim movements that you might have heard about. Movements like the Nahdlatul Ulama or the Muhammadiyah, which, just by way of example, the Nahdlatul Ulama has somewhere between 50 and 70 million members, right? The Nahdlatul Ulama is a country, right? And it is an organization which we know virtually nothing about. But they have come out publicly against the Islamic State. They've written their own scriptural interpretations. Right? It bears at least paying attention to what they're saying. The same holds true for Morocco. In Morocco, the Moroccan king is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He has enormous authority to speak on behalf of the community of the believers. And he's used that power to reshape Moroccan society by passing a new family code back in 2014, which elevated the status of women in society, by passing all these different reforms that has made Morocco competitive in terms of how it addresses inequality in the Muslim world, right? Again, not necessarily a perfect fit for what we're looking for, but something that we should pay attention to. And the last one is from a completely different area, in the Central Asian Republic of Uzbekistan, which for a quarter century languished under a Soviet-era strongman until the death of Islam Karimov in 2016. Since then, they've had 2 years of reform that have tried to upgrade the economy, tried to upgrade society, but what they've also tried to do, very importantly, is to reestablish Uzbekistan in particular, Central Asia in general, as a hub of tolerant Islam, right? Historic Islam. Because if you go back a millennia, a lot of Islamic innovation in terms of math, in terms of science, the innovations that are legitimate, that have come from the Muslim world, came from that place. So these are people who are trying to reclaim the narrative. So I would leave you with this. These are important voices, and they're voices that up until now we really haven't paid attention to at all. But if we don't want our counterterrorism policy to be defensive, to be reactive, and to be insufficient, I would argue that in the years ahead, as we begin to reorient our counterterrorism policy, we need to pay more attention to what these other parts of the Muslim world are saying. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we have time for questions from the floor. Eric?
Eric Rosen, Jewish Policy Center. Many questions, but Ilan, just I'll ask you one on the last thing you said.
Sure.
So as far back as V.S. Naipaul's book Among the Believers, which is like 30 years or so now, more, talking about Saudi influence, the Wahhabi influence, extending into the non-Arab Muslim world, and he talked about Indonesia. Within the last 2 weeks or so, I read an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the dangers of the growing tendency of Indonesian mainstream or modern politicians to accommodate more radical Islamist candidates, positions, and so on. How does that fit with what we're talking about?
So I think it's a good question, and I think it's more, there are things to worry about, but it's a little bit more nuanced than, I read the Wall Street Journal op-ed too. I spent a little bit over a week in Indonesia earlier this year looking at precisely this problem. The religious foundation of Indonesian society and also how it's changing, because you are seeing these indicators, including the ISIS returnees that in May carried out the string of the single most deadly bombings that have taken place in Indonesia in the last 30 years. And so there is that tendency, there is that worrying tendency of a more radical bent to Indonesian politics. I would argue this. In Indonesian society is not properly understood, as a local expert explained to me, strictly as a democracy. It's understood best as a communitarian democracy, meaning that which the most amount of people think is appropriate, and that which they don't is not. So if Indonesian society is trending in a more conservative direction, you will see these tendencies. You will see greater religious intolerance, and there's always been that tug and pull. But in that effort, these communal organizations like the Muhammadiyah, like the Nahdlatul Ulama, are not playing an unconstructive role. They're actually trying to buttress the authority of the state as it tries to deal with these things. So it's a long way of saying that this is a work in progress. Anybody who tells you that Indonesia is lost, I think, is not correct. But anyone who tells you that Indonesia is ours indefinitely, because it's going to be moderate indefinitely, is also not correct, because this is a dynamic, moving process.
Manda?
Yes, I'm an Iranian. I fled in 1979 for my life. Until 1979 and Khomeini policy of President Carter in Iran. Iran was a very peaceful country. Our society, we're very secular completely. We are still secular. Iranian people are. The problem here is, do you think that with all the crying that the Iranian people have been doing to the Western societies, democratic societies, and they have been asking for support? Do you remember 2009, the Green Uprising? All those young people marched around the cities in Iran.
We need the question.
Yes, and said, Obama, Obama, are you with them or with us? Well, the issue is that there is Iranian people, and then there is the regime of the clergies. What's your opinion about the policy that if United States, or we see the Western Europeans are pro the regime for their economic interests, but does the United States, should it follow their traditional foreign policy to support freedom and democracy, or continue empowering the tyranny of Islamic regime?
I think that goes to you, Lee.
Well, I very much admire the courage of the Iranian public, the large numbers of people who have taken to the streets and protested. I very much admire their courage, but I don't think that American foreign policy should be made with them in mind centrally. American foreign policy should be made with American interest in mind, and I certainly believe that it's in the American interest to weaken and damage that regime. I certainly believe that's the case. Though I have to say, in terms of the freedom agenda, I think it's been a catastrophe. And I would ask, I'd say, I hope that we get a chance to have this debate further at some point. I would say, what right now do we have in the war of ideas? What is the United States pushing in the war on ideas? I think at a certain point, especially coming out of the Cold War, I think the United States was very certain of itself, and for good reason. I think we have to look at what's happened here, not just over the last 15 years since 9/11 and since our engagement in the Middle East. What's our idea in Afghanistan? What's our idea in Iraq? I mean, we're protecting Iranian structures in Iraq. We're bombing stuff in Afghanistan because people think it's okay to bomb stuff in Afghanistan. For what strategic purpose? For what end? I think that we have to look at our domestic sphere right now, as we were speaking a little bit about before, and I look at the last 2 years and what are we exporting? What is our idea? Freedom of the press? When the American press has been involved in an insane information operation for the last 2 years? When the FBI and the Department of Justice, along with the press, have been trying to undo an American election, we're going to give that to the Middle East? So I don't know what the democracy promotion or the freedom agenda or what our war of ideas or what we're giving to the rest of the world at this point. I think it's a moment in our history where not just in terms of foreign policy, but more generally in terms of culture, the retrenchment is necessary. Americans need to look at what we've been doing, what we stand for, and what we believe, because right now it's a moment of profound uncertainty. So the idea that we're going to go around the world and tell people, hey, you should liberate women, or you should do this, you should do that. What's our package? What are we saying? So you ask about Iran, and that's my answer. The Iranian people deserve not only our appreciation, our respect, our admiration for taking to the streets against hard men with guns. That's a very serious thing. in prisons. That's a very serious thing. But you ask how the United States should perceive this, that's what I wanted to get at, not very clearly in my scattered presentation, but to say we need to get back and to understand things in terms of nation states. What is the American interest? How do we deal with these different things? So, I'm sorry, yes.
I would just follow up, and Chair's prerogative for follow-up, Bryen. That is not necessarily inconsistent with supporting uprisings in certain countries. I mean,
Yeah,
is there a
okay.
difference? Is there a difference between having decided to knock off the Libyan government because we decided to do it, and let's say broadcasting into Iran or making it possible for the Iranian people to know that we appreciate them, as you say, and respect them?
Could I?
That's a question, I think.
Do you want?
Was it a question?
Yeah, well, yeah. Let me sort of steal the mic for 1 second. So I have a slightly different answer. I think I end up in more or less the same place, but I tend to be a numbers guy, and so when I look at Iran, a country of, depending on how you count the population, right, 84, 85 million people, where 2/3 of the population is 35 or younger. They don't remember Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. They are protesting because the ideological ties no longer bind. They are protesting, they're protesting for a whole host of reasons. They're protesting because of economic mismanagement, because the Iranian regime is much more happy to spend blood and treasure on foreign adventures than it is on their own people. But they're also protesting fundamentally because they don't believe in the project of the Islamic Republic. And that's why these protests are different than what we saw back in 2009, but it doesn't mean that they'll succeed. I wish them all the best, but if the lessons of 2009 taught us anything, it's not enough to know what you're against. You have to know what you're for. You have to have a positive agenda that you outline. And for the United States, when we look at this potentially new revolutionary moment in Iran, those are the things that Americans are looking for. Is there a viable alternative to the current regime? There's certainly a lot of protests, and the current regime is terrible, right? We can posit those things. But I'm not sure we're seeing yet a viable alternative to the current regime. And I, in this particular context, I don't talk about people from outside of Iran who say that they're an alternative, because I think, we can have that conversation later. But the reality is, on the ground in Iran, you see people protesting, you see ferment, but what you don't see is you don't see the pendulum swinging decisively in a way that the United States can support. And I think that's at least part of the reason why we've been silent so far.
Lori?
So, Obama blew up the Pax Americana that kept stability.
Lori, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. So, Obama blew up the Pax Americana that kept stability in the region for decades and invited Russia back in when Russia had been gone for decades. Do you see, I guess this is more directed towards Lee and Ilan as well, do you see a national security interest in America trying to rebuild that Pax Americana? And taking that a step further, what are your thoughts on the relationship between Russia and Iran, Russia and Israel? Is war inevitable ultimately between Hezbollah and Israel? I know that's, a number of questions rolled into one.
So then I'll just go very quickly, but I bet Michaela is an interesting as well, because if you're talking about the Pax Americana, this depended on America's, strategic posture, which was heavily based on nuclear arms. I mean, I know I've written and I know that I've seen it in terms of Obama pulling a huge peg out of the Pax Americana, but there's lots of other stuff. There was the end of the Cold War. There was the freedom agenda. So I certainly think that Obama overturning things by saying, no, actually, Iran is our escape hatch for getting out of the region, I think that was, I still believe that. But also I think that we have to understand this in terms of a trajectory. Just the end of the Cold War itself was a problem for the American order. You can argue that what we understand as the Western order, as the West, and I think that we see this now more and more clearly with us in Europe, is the West was a convenient fiction for us to say, this is what we're leading. We're leading you. We're the West, Euripides, Plato, Moliere, whatever you want to throw. We now protect that. Is that true? Is that a real thing? It was part of our strategic posture. Are all these things still true? No, it's just not. Things have changed so much. And that's what I mean. So what is what do we have to do now to finally figure out what the post-Cold War posture looks like? I think to start in terms of nation states, in terms of seeing it in terms of tribes or in terms of sects, right? So who's the ambassador? Who's our ambassador to the Alawites? Well, we don't have one, and we shouldn't. So it's an important, interesting thing to look at how we perceive the rest of the world.
Michaela, would you follow up on,
Yeah.
do people believe that our nuclear deterrent, do other people believe in our nuclear deterrent as it is now, not as it perhaps it should be?
Yes, I do believe they do, because, if they did not, we would see significant effects of that. But, I think there is a common theme in all of our remarks, which is we lack strategic clarity. We don't have the luxury of lacking strategic clarity. And, I remember first time when I came to the United States, I think it was about 2004 or so, and I was just stunned. You could not tell that this was a country at war. And that's still the way it is. And that luxury, that is won on blood and treasure of our soldiers, our military, our leadership, it gives us this comfort, and it gives us this luxury to not have to worry about networks of the world and Irans of the world. And, in a way, when we were during the Cold War, we knew who the adversary was. We knew why it was important to focus on him and spend time to understand him. Today, we're not quite sure what it is that we need to understand and how to approach it. And that is a problem. Now, again, but because we're a democracy, I'm not quite sure if there is an easy solution to it. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. We'll take that one.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Josh Meyer from Politico, a reporter. So I missed Jane Hemingway's presentation. I had to cover Kamala Harris's speech, but I was hoping to ask her this, but it's a question for you too, and that is, given all the talk about tyrants, terrorists, and threats to the 21st century world order, I'm curious to hear what you think of the federal law enforcement part of this. I mean, it seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle since 9/11, and I wrote a book about the 10-year manhunt for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 mastermind, how they tried to get they did get a grand jury indictment of him before 9/11. After 9/11, there was no criminal prosecutions. More recently, I did some very long stories
Could we
about
get
how,
to the question?
yeah,
Question.
about Hezbollah and Iranian nuclear traffickers, and how investigations into those were derailed by the Obama administration because of the Iran deal. So I'm wondering, I mean, have we seen the end of international law enforcement efforts by the U.S., or what do you see as the role of them? And do you see the Trump administration trying to reinstate that? They did demand an investigation into my story, a task force to look at all the Hezbollah
Thank you.
cases.
Guys, if you,
I mean, it's always been part. I can speak a little bit for the nuclear side, where we constantly try to figure out ways and build capabilities that would allow us to counter smuggling of nuclear materials, expertise. We have a number of programs in place. So yeah, I mean, it's a big piece of the puzzle, right? You focus both on threats outside of your borders and inside.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and thank you to our panel for what I think was a terrific hour that we spent.
Thank you.